very excited when David brought this topic as a possible morning topic. So I'm going to kind of follow his lead. We are going to have a video, and then we'll have audience participation after that. So it's Zoobiquity, what animals can teach us about healing and the science of healing. So take it away, David.
Yes, well, thank you, Mary Grace, and hello, everyone. A pleasure to be here. A few Sundays ago, I was reading the LA Times and ran across an article on the front page, and it was about a Dr. Barbara Natterson-Horowitz. She's a UCLA professor, she's a cardiologist, and she has a long-standing interest in cross-species health. I thought it was an interesting topic. I mentioned it to Mary Grace, and here we are today. So it didn't take very long. So the doctor's latest focus is on cross-species similarities, especially in female health. It's a field that's unfortunately been underfunded and understudied. So diseases that get primarily affect women get a disproportionately small amount of investment, and underfunded and understudied. So the reverse is true, of course, for us men. So she, in the article in the LA Times, mentioned that we can't go back and sort of rectify the underfunding, but you can look at the problems that animals have with their health. And she was inspired by a consultation she had at the LA Zoo. Now, she's a cardiologist for human beings, but she was called in by the LA Zoo to look at a monkey patient that had cardiac problems and was experiencing some of the same symptoms of heart failures as her human patients. So she really, the start was of a project that would reshape how she practiced medicine. So she began informally researching every affliction that she had encountered in her human patients to learn whether the same affliction also affected animal patients. And she discovered that usually it did. You know, for example, koalas can catch chlamydia, reindeer, like some of us, seek narcotic escape and hallucinogenic drugs and mushrooms. Stallions self-mutilate. Gorillas experience depression. Animals overeat. They also get breast cancer. And some have fainting spells. So this pan-species approach to medicine is now known as Zoobiquity. She wrote the 2012 bestseller by the same name, Zoobiquity. She has also written a book entitled Wildhood, The Astounding Connections Between Human and Animal Adolescence. So it turns out that adolescence isn't just for humans. So we have a TED Talk, and I love TED Talks, so I'm looking forward to this one. So Mary Grace,
Sure.
you throw the button,
I'm going to screen, yeah, I'll screen share. I'm really glad Tim's here in case I have a problem. I wanted to add a couple of things. I just am in love with this woman and her practice. The thing that for me personally that I really love is we are animals. Hello, we're human animals. And she talks about somehow in the medical profession, but also with other laypersons, that somehow veterinaries are lesser doctors than physicians for people. And there's a joke in the veterinary community of the only doctors that only treat one species are the ones that treat human beings. And how helpful it's been for her to connect with the veterinary group. And that there's a certain snobbishness about medical school for doctors with human beings when it's more difficult to get into vet school now, and it has been for years. So there's kind of a softening of that separation between the different types of doctors. So I just especially appreciated that. Okay, so we're going to see if I can screen share. Okay. Tim, I'm glad you're here.
And this is her TED Talk.
It's actually not, because we picked the longer one. She had a
Okay,
couple of TED Talks that were 15 minutes. And we picked a longer one so that we'll have 15, 20 minutes for people to comment after.
And joining us now in studio, Barbara Natterson-Horowitz, cardiologist at UCLA and co-author of Zoobiquity, What Animals Can Teach Us About Health and the Science of Healing. Hello, nice to meet you.
Nice to be here.
Okay, I just said you're a cardiologist, but I have to say that sometimes in your job as a cardiologist, you got a phone call from the LA Zoo to come in and give them some advice on treating animals. And that's really where I want to begin, because I want you to talk to me about an encounter you had and a tamarin monkey named Spitzbuben. So tell me what happened with Spitzbuben.
So yeah, I'm a cardiologist. I take care of human patients. For 20 years I'd been doing that. And then the LA Zoo called and asked if I would come out and do some cardiac ultrasounds on one of their monkeys who they were concerned had heart failure. And it was a cute little tamarin, a Central and South American monkey. They lived at the top of the canopy of the rainforest, and this one was adorable. And
Fu Manchu mustache, we can see up there, yeah.
As we were sedating Spitzbuben, I was leaning down and making close eye contact with her because she was so adorable, and that's what I would do with my human patients. And the veterinarian put his hand on my shoulder and said, you know, please stop making eye contact like that. You're scaring her. You're going to give her capture myopathy. And I backed off, and everything went well. She did fine, but I had never heard of capture myopathy.
What is that?
Well, myopathy we see in human medicine. It means a disease of the muscles. There's lots of myopathies, but it turns out veterinarians know about a disorder when animals are scared, when they've been chased, when they're restrained, that sometimes their bodies can spew out adrenaline, hormones like that, and those can damage the muscles of the body, including the heart, and cause sometimes heart failure. So I was reading about this. It was very interesting to me as a human doctor, and then I had this kind of jolt of recognition, because recently, like in the year 2000, a similar diagnosis had been, a condition had been identified in human beings. It was given a Japanese name for the cardiologist in Japan who characterized it Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. But what it was stress-induced heart failure. It happened to people who saw a loved one die, who lost their life savings with the roll of a dice, people who were left at the altar. Intense emotions could trigger it. And so I put capture myopathy side by side with this Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, and I realized, my gosh, they're very similar, if not the same. But the thing that really hit me in that moment was not the similarity so much, but the gulf. Because it turns out veterinarians have been diagnosing this and writing about this in their literature for many decades, and human medicine only identified it a few years earlier.
You'd never heard about this?
No. And it made me wonder. I'm a cardiologist. I have expertise in a narrow area, but I thought, my goodness, what if my colleagues who are oncologists and nephrologists and psychiatrists spent time with veterinarians? What might they learn?
Okay, so you see this parallel between myopathy in a monkey and in a human. So how soon after your encounter with Spitzbuben do you begin to search for other links between humans and animals?
Yeah, I got really kind of captivated with this question. Do animals get? I mean, how extensive is the overlap between the conditions of animals and human beings? And I am a little bit embarrassed to admit the degree of my ignorance at the time, but I really had just never thought about it very much. But it turns out animals and humans get many of the same diseases. Veterinarians know this. They take care of these patients. So, you know, Cocker Spaniels with breast cancer, miniature ponies with diabetes, a killer whale with Hodgkin's lymphoma, and even STDs. There's an epidemic of chlamydia among the koalas. And so I applied this methodology. If I saw a condition in a human patient at UCLA during the day, I looked for it in the veterinary literature in the evening. And I just kept getting yes, 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 including behavioral disturbances. And that was also very surprising.
Okay, we're gonna go, you just listed off a whole bunch of animals, get a whole bunch of diseases that sound really familiar to me as a human, so I wanna go through them. So one of the ones that you mentioned was that koala bears in Australia, I think, get chlamydia. Tell me about that story, about how you've discovered that koala bears in Australia get chlamydia.
Well, my co-author, Catherine Bowers, and I simply asked, and each time skeptically, I should say, we wanted to be scientifically accurate, we asked, do animals get? So we asked, do animals get sexually transmitted diseases? And As it turns out, of course they do. I mean, animals are the original practitioners of unsafe sex, right? No condoms in the wild. And they have multiple sexual partners, so of course there would be STDs in animal populations. It turns out that one of the most well-known among wildlife biologists is an epidemic of chlamydia that's affecting the koalas of Australia. And in some cases, they're concerned that, that extinction is a possibility. They're working very hard to counter it.
So the fact that we now know that koalas get chlamydia, and we know that, you tell me in your book that veterinarians are rushing there to produce this vaccine for them. How would that koala research then perhaps inform a human public health strategy?
Right, so that's a great question, because throughout the book we have two phases to it. One is to point out these commonalities, many of which are very, very surprising. But then the more important question, the one that is really captivating to me, is why does this make a difference to human health? In the case of STD, I think there are two possible ways. The first is that yes, a vaccine that's developed for an animal population could conceivably be translated over to the human side. But secondarily, if we look for models of disease transmission among populations practicing unsafe sex, wild animal populations do provide that.
Okay. We're going to stay with the topic of sex for a moment, because, and I'm jumping around a little bit, but in your book you write about animals and foreplay and what we can learn from them. So go there if you would.
Well, one of the chapters called Roorgasm, and the idea is to ask skeptically and then scientifically identify parallels between animal sexuality and human sexuality. Because of course, we descend from animals. When we go to museums and we learn about evolution, we look at skeletons perhaps with our kids in the museum, we say, oh yes, we descended from that. But of course, every aspect of our bodies, our sexuality included, descend through our animal forebears. So Catherine and I visited some stallion breeding farm, for example, to learn about, say, stallion sexuality. We learned that the breeders of horses know that a young stallion needs to be brought up in a very specific way so that he's sexually healthy later in life, that he can perform well. For example, stallions, if they're put with mean mares for their first sexual encounter, that can have adverse effects on their performance later. If they have too much sexual activity too early, that too can adversely affect their performance. So there's a consciousness about this, which we thought translated over. In terms of foreplay, we learned that animals from mammals, other primates of course, to reptiles to even insects engage in essentially foreplay. And the purpose of it is to, in some cases, induce ovulation, increase female receptivity. Anyway, all of this was new to us, and we thought this is fascinating for human beings who are thinking about sexuality.
Okay, let's change gears. I want to talk about cancer, because you talked about jaguars getting breast cancer. Tell me about jaguars that get breast cancer, how you found out that they get it, and how it sort of manifests itself in them and what we can learn from it.
Right. So we asked, do animals get cancer? Many of us have dogs in our homes who, unfortunately, cancer is pretty common in dogs, certain dog breeds. For example, among golden retrievers and other large breed dogs, certain malignancies, there's an up to 60% lifetime risk. So that's, I think, familiar. But we asked, do animals in general get cancer? And we learned that, of course, they do. Recently, sadly, Steve Jobs died of a cancer that's also found in dog breeds, including Irish setters and German shepherds and others. And in fact, breast cancer, which is a very significant problem and continues to kill thousands of women every year, is found in many other animals. Mammals, by definition, have breasts, and breast cancer has been found in kangaroos, in llamas, even beluga whales. In doing the research, we delved into the veterinary literature, and we learned a veterinary oncologist who does comparative memory cancer research wrote a piece about cancer in big cats. And it turns out big cats, including tigers and jaguars, have an elevated incidence of breast cancer. The jaguars also, that she studied also, and by the way, these are, I should say, in all cases, we're talking about naturally occurring cancers. So these are not cancers that are being given to an animal in a lab. We're talking about spontaneously occurring disease in these animals. So breast cancer in the jaguars was accompanied with ovarian cancer. That pattern of breast and ovarian is also seen in women, some of whom have a mutation called the BRCA1 mutation. It's overrepresented in certain populations, including Ashkenazi Jewish women and others. So we thought that was very interesting that that genetic similarity was there.
They were predisposed to get it.
Correct. And then moving beyond that, so the first sort of surprise and for us was this species-spanning nature of cancer. Because sometimes we think we've given cancer to ourselves. And without a doubt, we do lots of things to amplify our risk of cancer, right? I mean, I'm a physician. I've spent my life taking care of people who've smoked and eaten their ways into all kinds of problems. But even if you stripped away all of our bad human habits, underlying that would be the potential for mutation. And with mutation comes the reality of cancer. And so when we thought about it, we asked, well, did cancer happen in the past? And of course, it turns out the fossil record indicates that there's evidence of cancer even among dinosaurs.
Dinosaurs got cancer.
Well, there's some bony evidence of it, yeah.
What do they call it?
I mean, there's no name for it. It's simply, we thought that it was, it expands many people's idea of cancer as being uniquely human and uniquely contemporary.
Another health issue that confronts humans is obesity. We hear a lot about it. You see it in your office as a cardiologist all the time. It's a major health concern. We do know that some animals can suffer from obesity, cats and dogs, for example. But you write about obese dragonflies, which I found, I don't know what else to say, but humorous when you imagine what that looks like. But tell me about obese dragonflies.
Right, so we asked this question, do animals get fat? And most of us know or have a fat cat or dog. 40% of our companion animals are fat. There's now actually a Catkins diet, a low-carb, high-protein diet for cats. Some dogs have actually, believe it or not, gotten liposuction. In some zoos, interestingly, they use Weight Watchers points to help their animals reduce. So yes, among animals under our stewardship, it's known. But we asked, do wild animals ever get fat? And in fact, they do. There are several populations that have been looked at, and they're noticing some increase in size. So that opens up this idea, well, why would that be happening? So there are a couple of explanations. Animals usually, it's very hard in the wild for them to find food, but sometimes there can be periods of abundance, a season which is unusually rich, predators that leave, so there's less fear. Under those conditions, animals do overeat. And what was, I guess in my mind, I thought, well, we overeat. You know, if there's cookies sitting on my desk, I'll eat them even after I'm full. And I thought animals don't do that, wild animals. But it turns out veterinary nutritionists know that easy access to abundant food leads to overeating and weight gain, regardless of the species. That's evolutionarily somewhat hardwired. So in wild animal populations, they see obesity. But there may be factors that go beyond access and abundance, including environmental factors, such as changes in seasons, changes in light and dark cycles, and even possibly infectious elements. Changes in what we call the microbiome, which are the tens of trillions of cells that live in our body that don't belong to us. And in the case of the dragonflies, a researcher noticed that some of the dragonflies that he was watching were flying kind of funny. And when they died, he looked at them and he looked at their bodies, and they had fat deposits that looked like what we call metabolic syndrome in humans. It turned out they were infected with a parasite. We offer that story in the book only to say, let's ask in an open-ended way, is there something more than diet and exercise? Are there factors in the environment, be they antibiotics that have found their way into our food stream, changes in light-dark cycles that are also driving the human obesity epidemic?
So we now you've drawn the parallel that yes, okay, dragonflies, for example, can be so can humans, but I guess beyond drawing the parallel, what are the implications? What can we take away from looking at dragonflies and put them on human health?
There are so many questions that are opened up by just expanding our ideas about why we gain weight. By the way, I take care of patients with weight problems all the time. For sure, diet and exercise, it works. If you decrease what you're eating and you increase your activity, yes, of course you'll lose weight. But it is interesting that there's this trend up, and it opens up the possibility that there are other factors that are affecting not only human beings, but other animals. So this species-spanning approach simply opens up the pathway for new investigations. One area that I think is very interesting, we know that farmers use antibiotics sometimes under some circumstances, not just to treat disease, but to make their animals fatter to have them put on more weight in response to less feed. Well, some of those antibiotics do get into our environment and our food stream. Is that playing a role in the human obesity epidemic?
Okay, questions that need to be answered. Your book also focuses on mental health. You have a background in psychiatry as well as cardiology, and you talk a lot about it, about mental illness in animals. So I want to talk about depression. Pretty common in humans. Do animals get depressed?
Right, so the classic definition of depression in human beings is very specific. We have this DSM-4,
The Bible.
The Bible, right. So, look, while we're very similar to animals, we are not the same as animals, and we're clear about that in the book, but we wanted to ask in an open-ended way, do animals ever exhibit some of the symptoms that we use to make the diagnosis in humans? And in fact, in animals from geese to sea lions to gorillas, naturalists have noticed behaviors in association with loss that look like human behavior, human depression, withdrawal from social activities, decreases in the amount of food that they're eating, and in some cases, a simple withdrawal and that leads to actual death. So I can't say whether those animals have depression. We are very different mentally than many animals, but simply looking at these behaviors side by side, I think, is worthwhile.
Another example that you talk about is the idea of self-mutilation. We know, again, that some people who suffer from mental illness cut themselves and things. You've noticed this in animals as well.
So applying this original methodology, do animals get, if I saw it in a human patient, I would look for it in an animal. And I was in my cardiology clinic one day, and a woman came in. She had palpitations, so her cardiac complaint was unrelated to this. But as I was examining her, I noticed that she had lots of horizontal lines on her left forearm, and we started talking about it. And I asked her, what it was about, and she described the relief that she gets from doing it, which seemed sort of paradoxical to me. But I went home and I asked, do animals self-injure? It was a surprise to me then. Now it is no longer a surprise because there are many, many veterinary experts who deal with this and know how to handle this. But yes, animals do injure themselves when they're stressed, isolated, and bored. We're talking about dogs who can lick their fur. Owners of German Shepherds and other breeds notice that dogs will sometimes lick their paw. It's called acrylic dermatitis until the fur comes off and the skin is denuded. Owners of horses, unfortunately, sometimes have what are called flank biters. These are horses that nip in the back of their flanks until they bleed. And bird owners have commented, and there's a whole literature on what's called feather plucking disorder or feather pecking. Some birds pluck out their feathers. That actually resembles, in my mind, a human condition called trichotillomania, which is the compulsive pulling out of eyelashes. But other birds peck their skin until they bleed. And we think that there are parallels to self-injury, i.e. cutting, and other forms of self-injury in humans.
All this it was so interesting to read about. I mean, I didn't know dinosaurs got cancer and all these other things, but I think one of the things that I found most shocking in your book is that animals can be addicted to drugs.
So we don't actually say that animals are addicted to drugs. We simply ask the question, do animals ever seek substances? Do animals get intoxicated? And we want to be really clear about that. We're not, overstepping it. But as it turns out, there are numerous species that do appear to seek out substances and then become intoxicated. Waxwing birds, Scandinavian waxwings and North American waxwings have been known to eat selectively of fermented berries, become intoxicated. The veterinarians call it flying while intoxicated. They fly into glass walls and die. We interviewed some veterinary pathologists who had done necropsies on those animals. Bighorn sheep will sometimes scale rocks to get to areas where there are lichen that grow on the rocks. They grind their gums into the lichens and have a kind of presumably a hallucinogenic effect. There's something called loco weed in the southwest United States that cattle go after, and so on.
And wallabies, I think you talk about.
Right, well, we opened that chapter in Tasmania. Tasmania has large medicinal opium fields, and they're guarded with, gates, but sometimes the wallabies jump over the fence, and some of them eat the poppy, and they have the poppy sap, and they become intoxicated. It's interesting that not all of them do that. Some do, some don't. And it reminds me of the human case where, you know, some kids experiment with drugs and they get hooked, and others, it's just something they tried some Saturday night and it doesn't mean anything. And I thought there were lessons for the human issue.
You know, what's so interesting is you have umpteen parallels that you draw between animal disease and human disease. And when I'm going through it, I'm kind of thinking, well, why didn't we already know this? So why didn't we already know this?
That's my favorite question because I don't know. I sort of bumped into this, but in fact, veterinarians and physicians don't do a lot of collaborating clinically. There is something called One Health, which is a growing recognition around infectious disease and zoonoses, whether the diseases from infections that come from animals to humans, that we need to collaborate. But clinically, comparative medicine, which is animal-human, has not really come to the human bedside. It's not in the hands of practitioners. I've been on rounds. I'm a professor at UCLA. I supervise medical students, interns, residents. We never talk about the animal case on rounds. Why? So part of it has to do with the cultures of medical and veterinary education. Some of it, I think, has to do with our ambivalent sense of ourselves as animals, as human beings. And I think I will air a little bit of dirty laundry about the medical profession. I don't think we consider veterinarians our clinical peers. Most physicians would be surprised to know it's harder to get into veterinary school than medical school. And I think veterinarians have actually a harder job in many ways. I mean, I became a better physician working with the vets. They have to be pediatricians, adolescent medicine doctors, and geriatricians. Depending on the kind of medicine they practice, they need to have a broad understanding of comparative anatomy, taking care of mammals, reptiles, fish. And they do it with patients who can't use words to tell them what's going on. So on the other hand, the veterinarians have a kind of comeback for us. They say, well, you know, physicians and veterinarians, we're all veterinarians. Physicians only know how to take care of one species. So
it's a bit of medical snobbery, a bit of competition between the two. And after you had made this link and learned so much about this, you came up with this term for this fusion between veterinarian and human and evolutionary medicine. It's called Zoobiquity. What does it mean?
Right. Well, Catherine and I really wanted to have a word that encapsulated this. So we thought, well, we're bringing together the cultures of animal and human medicine, so let's bring together Greek and Latin. And so zo is Greek for animal, and ubiquity everywhere. Ubiquity, Zoobiquity.
You have made up a new word.
We coined it.
Okay, so, you know, human doctors don't routinely, as you've said, cooperate with animal experts now. You write that they used to. What gave way? How did they used to collaborate?
Right. I mean, the history of the veterinary and human professions are old, going back centuries. There are discrete schools of veterinary medicine and human medicine. There are PhD dissertations and books that are written about it. But, you know, 100 years, 200 years ago, our lives as human beings were more connected to animals. But if animals have moved out of our lives, particularly around the turn of the century, when cars came in as a form of transportation, animals were relegated. At least in the United States, veterinary schools were placed in agrarian agricultural communities, whereas human medicine was in cities. So this separation happened and has continued. We're hoping we can change that.
The hope is that Zoobiquity will become a field of study.
Well, we really feel that every physician and psychotherapist and parent can benefit by thinking across the species divide. I mean, I'm a mom, I have teenagers. We wrote a chapter about adolescence. It's called Leaving the Nest. And so what are the things that we worry about as parents? I worry about risk. I worry about risk-taking. Adolescence is a very dangerous period for human beings. There's a high risk of accidental injury and death. And why is that? Well, adolescents don't judge risk properly. There is sensation-seeking, novelty-seeking that's been studied. And we asked, does that happen in animals? And it turns out, yes. Why? Because there's a shared neurobiology that drives post-juvenile, pre-adult animals to leave their natal group, to disperse. And they need to. So that risk-taking, which we wring our hands over, and as a mom scares the hell out of me, is actually necessary and is seen in nature.
So you're learning all kinds of things about your teenagers and why they behave the way they do. If Zoobiquity is fully accepted by the medical community, do you have hopes of physicians becoming healers of all species like they were, centuries ago.
Right, I don't know if that will happen, and that's not actually the goal, but I really like the idea of expanding our perspective, not thinking narrowly, developing new hypotheses. When you bring together two disciplines, invariably you can ask new questions. In the area, one area that pops up for me is this area of mental health. When a patient comes to us with whether it's self-injury or addiction, depression, OCD, we do a couple of things. We talk to them. Psychotherapists use talk therapy. We use psychopharmacology, which they use in veterinary medicine as well. Just as a tangent, one of the most popular veterinary drugs that's used it's called Reconcile. It's Reconcile. It's the veterinary form of Prozac, except it's infused with a beefy scent. But we use talk therapy, sometimes medication, but we also use cognitive behavioral therapy. Who are the great experts in behavioral therapy? The animal behaviorists. And as we spent time with veterinarians and behaviorists who deal with horses who self-injure, and birds, and dogs, we thought there's so much that a medical student could learn by working with a veterinarian.
I'm curious, how has this been received by your human doctor colleagues, this idea that they should learn from animals?
Well, we're just introducing it. One of the things we've done at UCLA in association with UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine is we have a Zoobiquity conference now where we bring together experts in veterinary medicine and human medicine to talk about the shared diseases of different species. So last year, we looked at glioblastoma, which is a brain tumor of humans and also dogs. And we have the veterinarian present a Rhodesian ridgeback. We looked at the CAT scan. We looked at a high school principal who had the same glioblastoma. And vets and physicians in the audience discussed these cases. We did it with heart failure. We did it with anxiety. And then we all went to the zoo and went on rounds at the LA Zoo. This year we're covering infertility. We have a DVM PhD from the Smithsonian Institute coming to talk about advanced reproductive technologies in endangered species like the giant panda and cheetahs. We're doing bullying as well, because it turns out bullying happens in animal groups, and we're going to try to develop insights for human populations. We're doing breast cancer and other topics.
Well, I think I learned a lot. I knew nothing about these links. It's very interesting. I think the medical community could stand to learn a lot as well. Thank you for writing this book, and thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
Wow. David, you're muted.
Well, go ahead.
Video, I just want to say couple of words. That video was from 2012, and we selected that because it was kind of a good overview, but she has really come a long way since then. It's really interesting what's being done. So that's all I have to say.
Well, in watching that video and her TED Talk, it brought to mind a question that maybe I had in my anthropology course, and that is, many people still maintain that the human being is so unique that it's in a special class, and it's a result in sort of a separation of us from the animal world. And so some of the differences that are supposed to be allegedly so important that make us so unique is our ability to engage in complex reasoning. As a lawyer, I would agree with that. Second, our use of complex language. Third, our human ability to solve difficult problems. Fourth, our human ability for introspection. That means that we can describe our own thoughts and feelings. Fifth, our ability for creativity. Sixth, the human ability to feel joy or sorrow or grief. And the question that really remains is, are these human abilities truly make us all that much more unique than animals? So generally, as scientists, and this is all from a little bit of research I did, that the more they study animals, the more they realize that these barriers are not especially true. So the scientific perspective is that we need to pay more attention to what animals are actually doing and see the world through their eyes. So let's consider language. Do we view animal language as limited just because we have trouble understanding it? Well, I think we're all sort of familiar with the language of whale songs. Turns out that they have hit songs, and I think many of us have heard the recordings of the humpback whale. So the whales are vocal learners. The songs can last anywhere from 5 minutes to half an hour. The songs can spread from one population of humpback whales to another. So, and a hit song in 1 year can be followed by a hit song in the next year. So these things are cultural, but human culture has been regarded as unique and not part of the animal kingdom. So let's consider the human ability to solve difficult and complex problems. Now, this is you can look this up on the internet. There's the videos of a crow trying to get food that's floating in a sort of a plastic tube. And the crow there's some small wooden blocks there, and the crow, smart crow, picks up the blocks, drops them into the column of water, and guess what? The water level rises, and they can get the food. In another experiment, the crow had to realize that one column of water was not suitable for this technique because it was too wide, and he didn't have enough blocks that would raise the water level, hence the level of the food, so he could get to it. So these crows solve problems and build tools and solve multiple problems with multiple steps. Well, are these problems difficult enough to sort of erase the barrier between human brilliance and crow brilliance? Also on the internet is some videos of, I think, taken in Russia, where the crow shows joy and enjoyment participating in snow activities. It was a form of skiing. So the crow found a plastic lid, and there's snow on the roof, and so he takes the lid, puts it to the top of the roof, steps on it, and goes sliding down the roof. It's such fun. That video is such fun to watch. Now, I know the crow's having much more fun than we are watching it, but still, it's just terrific. What about artistic ability? Well, gorillas and chimpanzees have painted pictures of birds, and they've described, yes, through sign language, what they were trying to create. They had a goal in mind, and they went ahead and made the painting, and it certainly would be a sign of some introspection. The chimpanzees and the gorillas are certainly describing their own thoughts. So this seems like being creative to me. Now, emotions, I think that we all have seen emotions in dogs and cats, but certainly other species grieve over the loss of members of their family. So those species would include elephants, wolves, sea lions, magpies, and many more. Now, we saw some pictures of javelinas. I had never been familiar with them before, but evidently they also grieve the loss of their family. And this was only discovered because of wildlife camera traps. Now, I mentioned I love TED Talks, and one TED Talk I especially love is by Professor Carl Safini. He's a professor at Stony Brook in New York. And Professor Safini, with respect to the barrier between animals and humans and our uniqueness, observes that we humans tend to assume that we humans have abilities that animals do not. So the abilities would be consciousness, intelligence, rationality, creativity, empathy, and love. Now, in his TED Talk, he provides numerous examples, some are humorous, that sort of demolish these artificial barriers that are cherished in many human assumptions. So he concludes what really makes us human is something that we are not even really aware of in what we think about. He concludes that the quality that makes us uniquely human is the fact that we are the most extreme.
I'm sorry, we only have about 2 more minutes.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. So let me just finish because I can finish in about 60 seconds. We're the most extreme in the sense of the most violent and the most creative, yet we're the most dangerous species on the planet. So he thinks that's the ability that we have that distinguishes us from the animal kingdom. Hope you enjoyed it. It was a pleasure talking with you.
Very
Thank
nice.
you, David, so much.
Do we have time for any reactions for maybe 3
I would
minutes?
think we have 5 minutes or so, yeah.
Let's do that.
Yeah, I think this is so important in terms of us human beings recognizing that we are animals, and not forgetting these origins. I mean, we all evolved from single-celled organisms, and eventually that evolved into a worm in the sea that has an alimentary canal, and that's what we are. We began as worms in the sea. And I say all that because I think we've become so alienated from nature, and we've raped her. I mean, we're destroying the planet and the plants and the animals, and it's horrible. And so I think it's really important to be reminded of our intimate connection with nature, even though we're the most advanced of the animals, but we are animals. Okay.
Thank you, Sam. Tommy?
Yeah, I realize the time is limited. I would love to extend this conversation. And there's another short video that I would like to show about interspecies communication, which takes this to the next level, which I'm sure David's run across. When is the next available time slot for us?
Well, why don't, afterwards, let's talk about it and schedule. That sounds terrific. I would love
Okay.
that.
Yeah.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other reactions? Let's see.
Nita and Jenny have their hands up.
Okay. Nita, then Jenny.
I am reminded of one of the most meaningful days of my life. I was walking down the street and there was a pair of crows, and they mate for life, as I understand. And they were flying around and they were having the best time and swooping and sailing. And one of them swooped down and was hit by a car and fell into the street. And the other one was immediately in a horrible state of panic and began, freaking out. And I ran into the street and picked up the crow and brought it over to the side so it wouldn't be run over. And the surviving birds started crying. And all of a sudden, there was a dozen crows, and they all gathered around, and they all swooped and circled the dead crow and brought the other crow in. It was absolutely, I could not believe my horrible privilege of being at that moment. That's all.
Oh dear. Thank you. Who's next? Someone?
Jenny.
Jenny, go ahead, Jenny.
Indeed, we are in the era of cell interconnection. And I believe that this is really quite exciting. When I grew up in Peru, we had a talking parrot that my grandmother would feed and talk. And we had a monkey, we had parakeets, rabbits, and we were always connecting with them. It was just a wonderful way to grow up with that interconnection with these animals. And I miss that. But it was lovely. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well,
Dana had his hand up.
okay, go for it.
Dana, didn't you? Or were you just exercising? Sarah has her hand up.
I don't think a conversation about interspecies relationship would be complete without involving the work of David Abram, who wrote 2 books, Spell of the Sensuous and On Becoming Animal. And they're incredible books in terms of talking about the inherent divinity of life itself, that humanity is really possessed with the sense of how special it seems to be, and we believe it. and that comes at a very big detriment. So anyway.
If
Thanks.
Dana, if I could just add, I heard him speak at the Young Society in LA several years ago, and I rushed out and bought his book, The Spell of the Sensuous. And then he has that second book, and they're a delightful read. I can't recommend them enough. So thank you for mentioning that.
Mm. There was one more person. Sarah, is it? Okay, and then we have to move on.
I just wanted to say, I mean, this is a very fascinating topic, really interesting. I just wonder if anyone is asking the question in reverse, because we certainly use animals. We do all sorts of experiments in labs on animals to advance medicine for us. But is anyone really using this advancement in medicine now to help animals? I just wonder, because in my experience, they're not. I mean, the human medicine is way more advanced than animal medicine is. So
the whole way that she got, the woman who just did this lecture, the way she was involved is because the LA Zoo contacted her for her assistance. So yes, it is making a difference, I believe. And that video was 12 years ago. It's very interesting to see that Zoobiquity, where it's gone since then. They have conferences now, and it's really interesting. But I love your question.
Yeah, and we'll have another session on this, I think.
Yeah.